I'm going to keep talking. Oh, there we go. Now I've heard my voice. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Manchester Poetry Library for this event. My name is Martin Kratz. I'm the program manager here. I am delighted to introduce this event. I'm just going to give you a few housekeeping notes. If there is a fire alarm, it's not been planned. Make your way out to All Saints Park. The toilets are out there on the right, immediately to leave the Poetry Library. If you are not a student and you're interested in membership, if you're a student or staff member, you have automatic membership here, but we are also open to the public. And if you're interested in public membership, come find me. And do seek out this program, which has all the readings that are coming up. We've got some people joining us online for this. Hello, people online. There in the camera, that's where I'm pointing at. Yeah, welcome for those of you who are joining us over the web. What we're going to do, slightly unusually, is we're going to turn the lights off just for a minute, because, as you know by the program title, the theme is night vision, and it's based on Professor Jean Sprackland's new book, which kind of looks at the history and psychology of darkness and our relationship to it in particular. It's also a real pleasure for me to invite to be doing this with Jean, who's curated these 3 sessions on exploring the theme of darkness, partly because of how it seems like a weird fever dream now, Jean, but kind of working on the Poetry Library together and actually having this here now. It was sort of pre and into COVID where we had to dream up a Poetry Library, and Jean was leading that, and here we are, which is sort of incredible to reflect on. So I'm really pleased. So it'll be lights off, some music, and then Jean will come and introduce our guests. But a really warm welcome from me today. And I'm going to hand over to Andrew. Lights off.
Hi, I'm going to loom up out of the dark. In my dreams, it would have been pitch dark in here. It would have been wonderful to do that, but health and safety precludes it. And also, we're on Oxford Road, so there's loads of ambient light out there as well. But it's a good reminder that darkness is not one thing. It's not one monolithic thing at all, actually. Oh, okay, now you can hear me. Great, thank you, Martin. Thank you very much, Martin, and welcome to these to the first in a little series of 3 events, all of them timed to coincide with the longer nights, with that kind of tilt towards the dark of winter. So thank you very much for coming tonight. I'm really glad to see you here, and I'm very, very grateful to Manchester Poetry Library and to Becky, who can't be here this evening, and to Martin in particular, who have made this possible. This place, Martin kind of hinted at the long gestation of the Poetry Library, even though it now feels as though it's been here forever. In fact, it hasn't been here forever, but it was that fever dream for a very long time before any spade went in the ground, as they say. Now it's here. I feel it's our treasure house, but I also feel that it's Becky and Martin's kind of energy and creativity that fill it with life. day after day. So, you know, we all have cause to be grateful to them. I've always been interested in darkness. Who hasn't, I suppose? But over the last few years, it's been an obsession. And out of that obsession comes a book, Night Vision, which I'm going to be launching here in this very room in a few weeks' time. And I had the idea of putting on a little series of events where I could invite some writers to come and share their work with us and think a little bit about the role that darkness plays in their work and their experience of writing the dark, if you like. You'll see from the programme that there are 3 of these events. The next one is on the 20th of November with the poet Karen Soley and with my book launch. Hope you'll be able to come to that. And then on the 4th of December, a non-fiction writer, some of you may know, called Dan Richards, and the photographer Helen McGee, who, this is her image, one of her images here, one I particularly love. She's done a lot of work in dark skies environments, but this one captures something more generally about nightfall, not just about starry skies, but about the experience of being in the dark or in the partial dark. So we start this evening with 2 absolutely stellar guests, Andrew Michael Hurley and Jacob Polley. Welcome both of you. Thank you so much for coming. I'm going to, in a minute, invite Andrew to kind of take the stage first for about 20 minutes, and then Jacob. And sandwiched in between those 2 readings, the 3 of us will have a bit of a conversation about darkness in writing. Hopefully we'll be able to shed some dark on the light. I think I'm going to put it that way round. The metaphors are always pulling us in a certain direction. So just first of all to introduce both our guests, Jacob Polley has published 5 highly acclaimed books of poetry. The 4th, Jack Self, won the T.S. Eliot Prize in 2016, and the judges described it as a firework of a book, inventive, exciting, and outstanding in its imaginative range and depth of feeling. He published a novel in 2009, Talk of the Town, which is set in and around Carlisle and won the 2010 Somerset Maugham Award. He's also written radio plays and film scripts and done all kinds of amazing collaborations in sound and performance work of one kind or another. I've known Jacob since 2003. I know. When his first collection, The Brink, came out. It does now feel a terrifically long time ago, but I've been transported by his poems from that moment to this. It's something to do with their depth, their lyricism, the quality of attention, and their sort of fierce humanity and humour and warmth. Folklore and the uncanny are key to much of Jacob's work, and this is one of the things that links our 2 guests this evening. Andrew Michael Hurley lives in Lancashire and is the author of 5 novels. The Loney won the 2015 Costa First Novel Award. In 2017, he published Devil's Day, and then Starvaker, which, as most of you will know, was adapted into a film starring Matt Smith and Morfydd Clark. And Barrowbeck, which came out last year and was based on his award-winning Radio 4 series, Voices in the Valley. Excitingly, Andrew has a new novel about to come out called Saltwash. I think it really is coming out any day now. Next week. And I believe you can hear more about that on the 28th of October at Blackwell's Bookshop up the road. Andrew's work is sometimes described as folk horror. Words like gothic, eerie, and uncanny crop up again and again. And of course, as a reader, I totally see why. But actually, I also think there are other ingredients that I particularly admire in his work: subtlety, openness. And one of my favourite comments comes from a review of The Loney that appeared in The Guardian. This is a novel of the unsaid, the implied, the barely grasped or understood, crammed with dark holes and blurry spaces that your imagination feels compelled to fill. Andrew, can I hand over to you? Welcome.
Thank you. Thanks. Thank you, Jean, for that wonderful introduction. I've never heard that quote before, so that was a nice start. Thank you very much. Hi, everybody. Thanks very much for coming. It feels like there's quite a lot I can say about the connection my work has with this theme of darkness. As Jean said, my work, novels and short stories, are often categorized as Gothic horror, folk horror, Northern Gothic horror, Pennine horror, Northern noir. These are all the kind of labels that it seems to have acquired over the years. And I wouldn't necessarily shy away from any of those things, because my books are about pretty dark subject matter. But just in preparation for this evening, it got me thinking about what I think I mean by dark. When I'm writing dark stories, what does that actually mean? And I think it's work that centers on things we perhaps don't like to talk about, things we don't like to think about, subjects that are taboo or transgressive in some way, or even grotesque. I write quite a lot about grotesque things. So things we'd maybe rather look away from, or things we'd prefer not to admit are real. Human behavior can be dark too, of course. And I think for me, the most unsettling stories that I've read and the most unsettling films that I've watched have not really been horror films per se. They've always been about sort of human evils, rather than ghosts and monsters and werewolves and vampires. So people scare me, basically. So human behavior can be very dark on a small scale, domestically, but also on a grand scale as well. We sort of look at the ecological damage that human beings have done, for example. Life itself can mete out very harsh blows, very harsh punishments, and drive people to behave in ways that are out of character or strange or bizarre. And that's very much something I was writing about in my third book, Starvaker. And aspects of the supernatural can make things dark too. So when things that shouldn't happen or can't happen in fiction, that takes us into a quite strange place, into a different dimension where sort of the binaries that we're used to break apart, or they become blurred and fuzzy in quite interesting and very often quite unsettling ways. And I think my work taps into all those different kinds of darknesses, things in the shadows of the mind, things that are normally hidden, fear of the unknown, the way that subconscious or numinous forces manifest in the physical world, all the stuff of horror. Basically, that's what my novels and stories are about. Tonight, I thought I'd read a bit from the book that came out last year, Barabek, because A, it's reasonably fresh in my aging mind. That's why I have to write everything down. And B, there are lots of different darknesses at work in this book, I think. So Jean mentioned a little bit where this came from earlier, but I'll say a little bit more about it now. So it's a novel that's structured in 13 short stories, which are adaptations of a series that I wrote for Radio 4, which aired a few years ago, called Voices in the Valley. So they're sort of expansions and adaptations of the much shorter pieces that I wrote for radio broadcast. So even though it's a book of stories, for me, it does feel like and reads much more like a novel. There's a chronology that takes us through quite a long period of time, from sort of 1st century AD, pre-Roman Britain, up to the near future in 2041. And it charts the rise and fall of this village out in the north. It's a bit ambiguous where it is. I'm thinking sort of Calderdale, Hebden Bridgey sort of place. But it charts the rise and fall of this village called Barabek over that sort of 2,000-year period. And the stories roll through the seasons. So there's a shape to it that you probably wouldn't get if you kind of sort of dipped in and out the stories and read them out of sequence. So for me, it is much more like a novel than a collection of stories. And the connective threads that are there between the different stories as well are pulled with a tightness that I think a novel has rather than a collection of stories. And I would say that one of those threads is darkness, or different kinds of darkness, which takes on different forms as the book progresses, but emerges primarily, I think, from the effects of those forces in the valley that the characters can't control. And that was one of the main things I was trying to write about in this book. It's a book that started life in lockdown, probably why there's a lot of stuff in there about being kind of hemmed in, and it's very claustrophobic. People are trapped. And it was really written in response to the shock of how quickly the world changed at that time, and how all the familiarities and routines and freedoms, all the things that we took for granted, suddenly went, and they suddenly seemed like things from a long time ago. They felt like they kind of been things of the past. And I think the pandemic really revealed to us how vulnerable we actually are to things beyond our control, both individually and as a species as well. And that leads us to questions about whether our lives can be shaped by the choices we make, if we have any power or agency over our individual destinies. And if we don't, then what does? So there's an overriding feeling for the characters in every story that there is something in the valley which holds sway over their lives. And quite what that is remains ambiguous throughout the book, and quite what its intentions are, whether they are malignant or benign, remain quite obscure. But this something does have agency, and it has intentions. They are just hidden from the people who live there. And it's the essence of the eerie. If any of you have read Mark Fisher's book, The Weird and the Eerie, he talks about something called the failure of absence in that book. Something that's there that shouldn't be there, and with an autonomy and motivation that we can't understand, we can't fathom. He says that the enigma might involve forms of knowledge and subjectivity and sensation that lie beyond common experience. And that's exactly what the people in the valley are kind of aware of all the time. So whatever is there in the valley, whatever force, whatever power is having some influence on the lives of the people who live there, it's seemingly alive and possibly sentient. But it's very natural for human beings to try and explain the inexplicable. Instinctively, we need to try and shine a light into the darkness of what we don't understand, and this is where folklore comes from. It's that attempt to try and explain what we don't know. In the first few stories, which start with the first settlers arriving in pre-Roman Britain, so about 1st century AD, the stories move through the medieval period and into the 18th century. The characters try to give form to these forces. They try and personify them in some way. So the first settlers who arrive in the valley believe that the wind and the snow that greets them and seemingly intends to starve them and kill them are actually gods, and the gods that they have to make a bargain with if they're going to stay in the valley, which they eventually do. In the second and third stories, this, what should we call it, pagan animism, has been replaced by Christianity. So the people are now kind of worried about devils and demons. But in the subsequent story, so when we move out of this into the sort of post-Enlightenment period, it becomes much harder for the people who live there to personify these forces. So to resort to folklore and superstition becomes absurd and laughable. You can't no one sort of believes in those things anymore. But without storytelling, the forces, the influence, the power, the antagonists, whatever it is there in the valley, and is penetrating into the lives of the people who live there, just becomes all the more mysterious. I think as a sort of side theme in this book is about the importance and the value of storytelling in our communities. In the later stories, the characters can see and feel the effects of this something, whatever it is, but can't locate or even begin to conceptualize its source. They are just witnesses to strangeness and weirdness and violence sometimes, which they either embrace or they try and get away from. That's a very truncated overview of the book, and I could say a lot more about it. But I thought I'd just read from one of the chapters that comes a little bit later on in the novel. So this one's called A Celestial Event, and is about the death of a character called Gracie, who's not from the village, but she marries someone who does live there. So she's kind of an outsider who comes into the village. The narrator of the story and his two friends are convinced that her death has been caused by this something, this workforce or whatever it is in the valley. But her widowed husband, Bill, seems to be oddly unaffected by what's happened to her. And a couple of days after the funeral, he's simply carrying on as if nothing's happened at all. And it's a story that ties in nicely with the theme of darkness, as the characters have been invited to Bill's house to go stargazing. So this is called a celestial event. I got to Bill's early and let myself in, finding the house loud with music that, given the circumstances, seemed far too bright and joyful. After closing the front door, I called for him and looked in on the empty living room, where he had some jazz number going on the record player, and then called again and got no answer. And just for a moment I thought, well, they say that when one goes, the other sometimes follows from a broken heart. But when I went into the kitchen, I could see him through the window setting up his telescope in the backyard. "It won't be a moment, Frank," he said through the glass when he noticed I was there. "Help yourself to a drink." He seemed as breezy as ever, as if nothing had happened at all, and Gracie was about to descend the stairs, genial and smiling, as if it was any other society night. The pretense might have comforted him, but this striving for ordinariness only upset me the more. The kitchen wasn't spotless. If it had been, it might have indicated that he was skipping meals, nor were there towers of dirty plates to suggest that he'd stopped caring about the little things that, he liked to say to Gracie, separated them from barbarism. Nothing was amiss. He wasn't just surviving. It was quite the reverse. He'd obviously tried to make the place as welcoming as it always had been. As well as the music, he'd put up a small artificial Christmas tree by the back door and set the lights so that they blinked in randomized patches of colour. On the table sat a decanter of sherry and 5 lead crystal glasses. And in a modest imitation of the spreads Gracie would lay on when it was her and Bill's turn to host a society meeting, he turned out an ingot of duck pate onto a plate and arranged some bread rolls in a basket, along with the waxes of cheese that didn't get open at the wake. "All set," he said, as he came into the kitchen, rubbing some warmth back into his hands. "I just need to give the lens a clean." I asked him how he'd been. "Me? Oh, fine, he said, as though it was only recovering from a cold. "I'd have come and seen you," I said, "but I thought you'd want some time to yourself." Oh, we'd all thought that. Me, Virginia, and Duncan. It had been a genuine assumption, genuinely made. But when Bill had telephoned earlier that day to ask me over, I felt terrible about having kept my distance since the funeral. It must have seemed as if I was ignoring him. You can only go on what you know, I suppose, and quite wrongly I'd thought that Bill would be feeling just as I did when my Catherine went. The last thing I'd wanted to do then was socialise. In fact, I've not been able to face seeing anyone for weeks. But everyone was different, of course, and Bill's reaction couldn't have been more opposite to mine. It's after the funeral that bereavement truly begins. Prior to that, the numbness of the loss and the distraction of all the bureaucracy required to tie up a life acts as an anaesthetic. You go through the motions, as they say. It was like that for me and Catherine. Sadie and Amanda stayed on for a few days, but they had lives of their own, jobs to go back to, and once they'd left for Manchester and Leeds and I was in the house alone, the pain started to do its worst. I certainly hadn't been able to smile like Bill. I was hardly placid. In fact, I'm not sure I'd ever felt so much anger in me before. It was a kind of anger a child might feel at having something taken away from them for no reason. An indignation at the rank unfairness. Why couldn't I have her back? It wasn't much to ask. She was only one person out of billions. What difference would it make to undo her death? Such thoughts plague you at a time like that. And other thoughts, worse thoughts. But not for Bill, it seemed. As he rooted about in the cupboards above the sink, he whistled along cheerily to the music from the other room. And when he found what he was looking for, a square of chamois leather, and noticed me staring at him, he said, all hale and hearty, "Come on, Frank, lad, pour the drinks, they'll be here soon." He patted my shoulder and went back out to see to his telescope. His bow tie was crooked, I noticed. Its lopsidedness, the only crack in this facade of normality he was trying so hard to sustain. It was a small detail, but one which proved unequivocally that Gracie was gone. Had she been there, she'd have smartened him up straight away and attended to that yellow dicky bow as though she was putting the finishing touches to a ribbon on a present. And then she'd have thumbed something off his chin, held his face like a chalice, and brought his head down from its great height to kiss his brow. All that love. He'd been so unexpectedly blessed. He'd come close to getting married a couple of times in his younger years, Bill, but for one reason or another, mostly the cold feet of the other party, it hadn't ever quite worked out for him, and by the age of 69, he'd long since resigned himself to bachelorhood. But then, by chance, he'd met Gracie when she came to sing 9 lessons and carols at St. Gabriel's. She'd been given the responsibility of opening once in Royal David's City, and on the very first note, Bill had turned in his pew to look. They hit it off, swapped phone numbers. He started driving over to see her when she came to the valley, and they were married a few months later before the end of March. Well, what was the point of hanging around at their age, Bill said, as if he thought we'd disapprove of me getting wed so quickly. But none of us had any reservations about that. He was quite right. On the threshold of our 70s, we couldn't pass up opportunities of any kind, especially in Barrabeck, where life, or our equivalent of it, revolved in a very small circle. No, I was pleased for Bill. The only sticking point was whether he might sell up and move away to live with Gracie, and selfishly, I didn't want him to leave. Or rather, it was more that I wanted Gracie to stay. By then, I was as hooked on her as Bill was. She was one of those people lucky enough to have grown old elegantly, meaning that time had practiced upon her gently, and the changes that had wrought were inoffensive. No unsightly warts, boils, glaucoma, bristly chin, reptilian wattles, spider veins, or tooth decay for her, but a liveliness in her eyes and cheekbones that had kept their shape. And although her hair was cut short, it was still thick and more sandy than grey. I wasn't only attracted to the way she looked, I give the description to make the point that she'd stayed youthful because of how she was in herself. She somehow managed to ward off the cynicism that hardens like a corn in old age, and retained a passionate fascination for other people's lives that, I must admit, seemed like an affectation when I first met her. But then what a pleasant surprise it had been to realise it was entirely sincere. Bill called to me from the outside. "The sherry, Frank," he said, and I unstopped the decanter. We always had a glass of sherry before our, what would you call them, classes, soirees. They were Gracie's ideas, these get-togethers. It was she who suggested we try and teach one another something new. There was always something more to learn, she said. It didn't matter how old we were. We'd never thought of it before. I don't know why. It seemed such an obvious thing to do when at our age we knew full well how easy it was to languish in habit and apathy. But Gracie was one of those perceptive types who could just see so clearly what other people needed. It was why Bill fell for her, why we all fell for her. It's not an overstatement to say that when she moved here, she woke us up. Her interest in us roused the confidence that we didn't know we had or we'd lost somewhere along the line. We'd taken in turns to play host and enjoy the routine, but Bill's session was always something of a movable feast, one that was dictated by the schedule of the heavens and the whim of the weather. The two things being favourable that night, it was the reason he'd insisted on us coming over. The December sky was crisp and clear, and according to Bill, there was to be a wonderful celestial event. The doorbell rang and he came in from the yard to answer it with a bemused look on his face. It was always open house on society evenings. No one ever stood on ceremony, but things were not as they were. Everything had to be recalibrated now. As Bill's friends, it was our responsibility to help him do so. And I wondered if by just walking in as usual, I'd clumsily endorsed his delusion that everything was fine. They come over together, Duncan and Virginia, and followed Bill into the kitchen from the hallway, making the same kind of small talk I'd made, no doubt thinking the same thoughts about the music and the Christmas tree, and noticing as I had that there were one too many glasses on the table. As they chatted about the weather, Duncan anxiously scratching at his beard, Virginia thumbing the wooden beads around her neck like a rosary, they sent furtive glances my way. What was Bill doing? Did he honestly want to give us an astronomy lesson tonight? It had only been a couple of days. Was he really well enough to be entertaining us? You didn't really need to go to so much effort, Bill, said Virginia, appraising the display of cheeses. I agreed and said, it would have been all right with just a drink, you know. We weren't expecting all this, Duncan added. That was no bother, said Bill. Couldn't let you go hungry, could I? I'll get you a knife. Frank's been, Mother. I handed Virginia a sherry, then gave one to Duncan and Bill before pouring my own. You missed one, said Bill, nodding at the spare glass on the table. I filled it halfway and expected him to drink to Gracie, but he put it to one side and raised the toast to something completely different. Here's to it staying clear, he said. They might say it might snow later. We sipped and looked at one another, and to fill the awkward moment, Virginia said, "You know, we're all intrigued, Bill, about what it is you're going to show us." "I've been watching it for the last 2 nights now," he said. "Well, since the funeral, then." "And, go on," said Virginia, eyeing his dishevelled bow tie, itching to straighten it as much as I was. He smiled at her. "You don't want me to spoil the surprise, do you?" "Well, no, I suppose not, no, but it's just the most beautiful thing," he interrupted her. "You wait, it won't be long now." He checked his watch, knocked back his sherry, and went out into the yard again, his hands on his hips, as he gazed up into the sky. Thank you.
I think maybe, no? Okay. Well, we'll pass the mic. Oh no, there's a spare. Look, this is amazing. The place is incredibly well furnished. Thank you so much, Andrew. I forgot
Pleasure.
to mention, of course, that Andrew is a colleague here in the writing school here at Manchester Met. I feel like for both of us, this is kind of home, and we should probably both be in our slippers or something as we sit here chatting.
I did think about that, but
Oh. I wonder if you could say a bit more, Andrew, about this central question for me, of what darkness means to you as a writer. Because, of course, it's always played a part in horror and in the literature of the uncanny. It's an ominous space, isn't it, in which scary things and kind of mysterious, sinister presences lurk. Is that the whole story about how it functions in your work? Or do you sometimes seek to kind of subvert that at all?
That's a really good question. I think it's sort of a primeval fear, isn't it? The dark, what you can't see, possibly house things that are going to kill you. So I think that part of our brain is still in operation. That's why horror films are still scary, I suppose, aren't they? Things that lurk in the darkness. How does it manifest in my work? I think, as I said before, I'm kind of interested in what's hidden away, I suppose, what's not said, what can't be described, maybe. I think that's kind of how the best horror works for me, where you don't really see anything very much, and it sits sort of out of your frame of vision, maybe even out of your frame of reference, actually. I think certainly horror films where there are lots of jump scares and are very kind of gory don't really frighten me very much at all. But I think the most unsettling ones is where you don't ever see the thing that's the antagonist at all. I'm thinking of something like amazing film Picnic at Hanging Rock, 70s film where I could talk all day about this film, but where there's something in the landscape itself. There's some power, some entity that has agency and intention, but it's just unfathomable to the characters in that film, and sort of spirits them away to where we don't know. So yeah, I think that's what I think a lot of my work touches upon that. And if there is something in the landscape itself, like what is that? What is hidden away? Is there some way that events can be kind of imprinted onto landscape as well and be revived at a later stage by people kind of blundering into them? I kind of think they can. I'm not quite sure what the mechanics or the process of that is, but so yeah, I think different kinds of darknesses. I think probably really kind of dip in and out of my work a lot, actually. Yeah.
And that sense of darkness in the landscape is part of it, isn't it? But also I noticed that in your work there's a kind of great variety of dark spaces. They're not all, it's not always about nighttime for a start. So I'm thinking about in The Lonely, where there's a kind of dark space under the floorboards where dangerous things are hidden. And there's a cellar, and there's a cupboard under the stairs, isn't there, where you can hide. And there's also underwater darkness and dark woods. So there's a kind of whole sort of panoply of different kinds of darkness, I suppose, and different kinds of space in which we might experience darkness. And I'm thinking also about an amazing description of a cave, which I think was, a tar black mouth in the hill. This is in Barrowbeck. And particularly the way you go on to talk about how sensory perception is altered by being in that dark space. So there's something about the sound. Even cautious whispers echoed too freely against the rock and drifted away down fissures and passageways that they could not see. The sort of combination of the darkness and the echoing space of the cave. It makes me wonder, I guess, what your own experience of darkness has been, and maybe going right back to childhood, and whether, how much of that has kind of got into the work somehow.
I'm sure it has somewhere along the line. I don't know. I think I've always been really interested in supernatural stories, ghost stories, horror stories. I brought up as a Roman Catholic. I think there's a huge overlap between being brought up as a Roman Catholic and interest in horror. If you draw a Venn diagram, there's a big bit in the middle. Because I think you were sort of brought up in that tradition. You're asked to believe in, or not asked, you're compelled to believe in, angels and miracles and transubstantiation and bilocation, all these kind of things. I remember my mum, who's much more fervent Catholic than I ever was, taking me to some very odd masses and services around Easter time where, the priest would bring out apparently a bit of the tree cross, and we'd have to kind of line up and sort of give reverence to the thing. So I don't know, I feel like there's a lot of darkness in religion. I think there's a lot of darkness in Catholicism. There's a lot of mystery in the Catholic Mass and the ritual. So I think maybe kind of being brought up in that environment inevitably kind of pushed me towards an interest in all things that are kind of hidden and numinous and mysterious, I think. But you mentioned just then that the sort of sensory effects of darkness. For my second book, Devil's Day, I wrote an essay about a night walk that I did in the valley where that novel is set. So it's based on a real place, the Langdon Valley, which is out near in the Trough of Bowland, which you may or may not have heard of, but it's sort of out in the sticks, sort of near Clitheroe, East Lancashire way. So the valley in the novel is a lot more populated than the valley is in real life. In real life, it's just a kind of a big sort of 4-mile space of nothingness, but sheep. But part of my process as a writer is to spend a lot of time in the places or the type of places that I'm writing about. And so I spent a lot of time in that valley, walking it different times of the year and different weathers, and different times of the day as well. But I really wanted to be there in that transition from daylight to dusk into darkness, and so I could try and render that authentically on the page. And it was a really odd experience to be aware of it and to be conscious of. Most of the time we're not, it just kind of happens, it's outside and happening well away from you. But to be there and sort of specifically going for that reason, to experience that transition, was really, enlightening, if that's not too paradoxical. But yeah, it's certainly your senses are really old, particularly at dusk. Maybe not in darkness so much as dusk, where your eyes are really straining with a waning light, and so it becomes very difficult to judge distance and gradient. The fells become kind of flat. They're just a sort of bulk. It flattens the bulk of them, and sound becomes really strange as well. So there's some connection between kind of visual hallucinations and aural hallucinations as well. And just the sound of the beck running down that valley just produced really sort of strange echoing effects where it sounded like a dog or someone like shouting. And so you can totally see why the dark has always been this place of terror for us, I think, really, because you just everything gets altered.
Yeah, absolutely. Even your sense of balance.
Yeah, balance.
Your
indeed,
sense
yeah.
of space and where you are in space, all can all be affected by being in darkness. Yeah. I'm also interested, and you've kind of alluded to this a little bit already, really. It goes back to this idea of altered perception, but also to the uncanny, I think, in the way darkness becomes tangible in your writing. So it often takes on substance. It even sometimes becomes animate. So in Starvacre, the boy, Ewan, is told not to be afraid of the dark, and he replies, "But it was talking to me." And that's like hairs on the back of the neck immediately for the reader, isn't it? At another point, darkness is said, there are people in a room, and darkness is said to fall in on them. A bit like a ceiling falling in and crushing you or something. So there's this sense of darkness having this kind of, maybe having agency, certainly having substance. And I wonder if that's just if that's just related to how darkness makes you feel sometimes, or if it's kind of a deliberate strategy to make darkness almost like a character in your stories.
I think the latter, really. Yeah. One of the things I try and do in all the work that I produce, I think, is to make the setting a character in its own right, and that involves darkness, includes darkness for sure. And yeah, I think I suppose I choose locations that have the potential to be as complicated as the human characters, and as nuanced and layered and sort of full of enigma and strangeness and potential violence as the human characters in the novel. Because I think that just really fascinates me, that idea of how the places are not just made from their sort of physical essence. There's always something more to it. There's also always more layers to any space that you go to. And I'm really interested in that kind of deep mapping of place and getting down through the layers and seeing what's there. Because I certainly felt like that, certain places that I've been to, you feel, I don't have any belief in ghosts or anything like that, but certainly you go to places, they have an atmosphere, they have a feeling, there's something that is almost tangible and palpable there. And if it's haunted, I'm not quite sure what that means, but it certainly has often kind of physical, often visceral sort of effects on you. And it may be that it's sort of, weighted with stories or folklore or superstitions that already exist, but that's not always the case. I've been to places where I know nothing about and felt something really kind of strange and do you know what I mean? So yeah, I think the fascination with that, I think, creeps into my work a lot, actually. Yeah,
I think it really does. Can I bring you in as well now, Jake? I'm just going to kind of shuffle backwards a bit so I can see you both at once. Because I mentioned that there was this connection between the two of you in terms of your kind of interest in the uncanny and in folklore, but also there's another connection, which is northernness. You live in Lancashire, I think, Andrew. Yes. Jacob, you grew up in Cumbria. You live now on the northeast coast. And I wonder, I don't know if it's just kind of fanciful, but it seems worth asking the question, is there something about, northern darkness, do you think, that has a particular quality that is of interest to you in your work? Oh, sorry. Yes.
That's a really interesting question, but a really hard one to answer, I think. I do, when you ask me that, I immediately start thinking about the way that obviously we move up the country, don't we? We move up from the south, up north, up towards Scotland, where the hours of daylight alter and change and stuff like that. So I suppose I'm wondering about that, but I'm also thinking about my, because I was thinking about the dark really as like it's like the fundamental texture of my kind of childhood, really, growing up like out of the city in the country. So I grew up out in the country, and I grew up somewhere that was, you know, like dark. You know, it wasn't street lit. It wasn't. So there was a kind of quality of darkness to my childhood, which I still think it obviously informs my experience now as an adult of darkness, and also that experience really of childhood terror of the dark, I think is still there for me in all my kind of evocations of the dark and all my kind of thinking about the dark. So, yeah, I think maybe in terms of just lightlessness, you know, we're not, because you know, interestingly, I had family in London, you know, so I was, you know, I moved from London to Carlisle. I went to see my granny and grandma down in Essex, you know. So that experience of, you know, a great city where it's not dark, you know, we're in a kind of urban space, we're in a kind of cul-de-sac where it's all lit, you know. And then I go back to my kind of childhood dwelling where, you know, we live in a house which is creaky and it's very, very dark outside and it's very, very dark inside, and you know, it's really creepy, you know.
Yeah, that's interesting, because it's interesting that you talk about terror and the kind of creepy aspect to darkness, because it seems in your poems that sometimes they're really unusual in the way that you turn towards the dark rather than away from it. So obviously, in poetry generally, darkness is one of the great metaphors. But it almost seems sometimes as though your poems they almost resist that. And I think, again, it's perhaps to do with that thing that I mentioned earlier of the quality of attention, of your kind of paying attention to what darkness is really like and what it really feels like to be in it. And for you, it's not maybe populated with, sinister presences so much, but often with quite recognisable living things like foxes and boys out fishing or getting drunk in the lanes, and insects. You know, there's that wonderful poem "Little Things" where we've got the little things with wings beating like eyelashes. So, and often also kind of what I would think of as accessories of the dark, like sources of light, like torches and street lights, but also shadows and a dark tarn at night.
I'd forgotten all these things.
You'd forgotten all those things.
Yeah.
I know more about your work now than you do. And I guess out of all of those, one particular thing really comes into focus for me, and that's the moon.
The moon.
Because you write about the moon so much.
Yeah.
And I wonder whether you can say, we can't always say why, but I wonder whether you know why.
No, I don't know. I don't know why. Because, you know, there is this sense, of course, that the moon is, you know, one of the great kind of poetic images, right? So great, so old that it's a kind of it's a bit worn, you know, it's a bit old. It's not something that you would think a contemporary poet would be kind of interested in, and yet for me, there's something about it. So I think that the moon and the dark, these two phrases, as well as kind of what they indicate, are kind of totemic in my work. There's something that I just return to and return to and return to because they mean something, but I don't know what they mean, which is why I kind of keep going back to them. And I think that's why it's always worth me going back to them, despite the kind of history of the poetic history, the literary history of kind of moon gazing. That there's something else for me in that isn't yet solved, despite the kind of literary history and O Moon with How Sad Steps, you know, the Philip Sidney poem, you know, all the kind of great moon poems, you know. So yeah, there's some. So the short answer is no, I don't know why. Apart from, you know, still being, you know, bewitched by the moon, you know, bewitched by the moon, and with a kind of belief that it does, you know, I am kind of influenced by it somehow, not just in my work, but somehow, you know, physically and kind of psychologically and emotionally, the moon has some bearing on my life, you know, that I know when it's a kind of full moon, you know, I somehow I'm kind of tuned to that, you know. I'm often a bit, I don't know, funny. I'm a bit weird at the full moon, and then I kind of look up and it's like, oh yeah, no, it's a full moon, right? Okay, I understand, you know.
Yeah, that's interesting. And there's a. I'm going to ask you to read us some poems now, but I was just thinking about that line in one of your moon poems. I think it's Moon Quilt Essay. Great title.
Thanks.
My life is scrap. The moon, a needle pushed through night and day. Something to do with time, not just measuring time, but almost the making of time somehow. Yeah,
and the marking of time by phases, and you know, kind of all that really. But it's interesting as well that you know, Andrew's mentioned. You mentioned a couple of times kind of not speaking and kind of speechlessness, and I think for me there's a kind of analog between darkness and unspeech somehow. So it isn't just that there are unutterable things in the dark, but that somehow the darkness stands for me for, in a really profound way, not speaking, not being addressed without being spoken to somehow, you know.
Will you read us some poems?
Yeah, I'd love to. Yeah. Shall I stick that in there? Oh, thank you. Oh, it's so nice to be here and kind of stand up and stretch my legs. Can you hear? Can you hear at the back? Rocking. I thought I'd start with a lullaby, believe it or not. This is just called Apples and Pears, and like I said, I'm not going to pretend that my family down in London were kind of full of they are a bit kind of knees up Mother Brown. Do you know what I mean? A bit kind of London, what do we call it? Rhyming slang and all that. But so they are a little bit like that, round the old Joanna and things like that. Do you know what I'm on about? Everyone's just kind of going, what is he talking? Has he gone mad? Is he having a stroke? But this is so this is just called Apples and Pears. You know, thinking about the stairs really, up the apples and pears to bed. Is this familiar? Do you know? Did you have this? Did your parent or somebody kind of say this? But anyway, so apples and pears, and it is a kind of lullaby, I suppose. Apples and pears, hush, sleep, get bigger, grow older. The world is smaller, the cold sea colder, deader, deeper. Torchlight in the back cave, lamplight on the hillside, and soon we must leave this room in the roof, but not yet. Quiet, lights out, the geese go over. Will we be rich or faithful or clever? Our mother's hands like music rest, and all the windows fill with frost. Our fathers stand on the bottom step, listening. Soon we must leave, but not yet. Tuck up, drop off. Tomorrow is fit for us and full of old smoke. Time in the clock's hands, down in the duvet, bark on the elm tree, and we've yet to go grey. Mind in the dark, mice in the roof. We dream the dream we each deserve. The steep, empty staircase falls away. I thought I'd read a month poem as well, a year poem. So I'll read this. It's just called October. You know what you shouldn't do? You shouldn't say, oh, I'm going to read this, and then fail to find. October. Although a tide turns in the trees, the moon doesn't turn the leaves, though chimneys smoke and blue concedes to bluer home time dark. Though restless leaves submerge the park in yellow shallows, ankle deep, and through each tree the moon shows, halved or quartered or complete. The moon's no fruit and has no seed, and turns no tide of leaves on paths that still persist, but do not lead where they did before dark. Although the moonstruck pond stares hard, the moon looks elsewhere. Manholes breathe. Each mine's a different, distant world. This same moon will not leave. A lunarian is somebody who's kind of obsessed with the moon. And so this is just called lunarian. I suppose it's a kind of direct address of the moon, with lots of kind of bits and pieces that are kind of gathered from different kind of traditions of moon gazing, and some things kind of made up. This features a kind of very kind of personal detail, which is that I used to go on holiday, weirdly, near where I live now. So I used to go on holiday in a place called Newbegin on the northeast coast at my grandpa's house. And this has kind of got a bit of that in as well. Lunarian. There's a man in you, his face like melted tallow. For yours are the old words, and yours the old, unusable, soot-grimed things. I spy you tonight, one night from full, through a pair of cheap binoculars, hauling up the mountainside your gong of chalk. If there were a pond nearby, upon whose surface you might lean your subtle silver highness, I would try to gaff and grapple you out of courtesy. For some nights there's more bulge to the seas, more reflectance from your coal-bright craterscape. But tonight, unreason separates from reason, as oil from water, dark from light, bedspread from blackout cloth, your reflection from yourself, O creamy, scraped-out shell of a king crab caught off a northeast sea coal beach, no less a beach for glittering black, its anthracitic curve laid down along the length of my occluded early mind, at Grandpa's house in Newbegin, where at night I heard the harbour bell clonk like a bell around a black goat's neck. O Caprine Sea, O Grandpa Dark. There's a moonlight man with cords of silk who binds the destined together. But tonight my mind's undone, great turner away, O hole of holes, walnut of night. You turn the tides, so give me blisters, burn my retinas, break my heart. Prove by silence that the mouth that speaks the moon should whisper, the night is still, the stars are fixed. You are the moon, your silver dress, your disappearing constancy. The night is still, the stars are fixed. We move through phases of the flesh. I wrote this book, Jack Self, which is a kind of single narrative in poems, kind of. So I'll read one of these, which obviously will lift it out of this narrative. It's just called Jack-o'-lantern. It's kind of got moons in again. You kind of get the idea. I've picked all the moon poems. Jack-o'-lantern. And Halloween as well. Halloween's such a kind of resonant time for me. Jack-o'-lantern. The leaves a slimy yellow light, the year's a sticky door, the wind bangs in the barest trees and shakes the apple core. No, again. The leaves a slime, the year a bloodshot eye, the trees the rooms of bedlamites with bars across the sky, the winds inside the apple core, the moon bangs like a drum, and no, again. The skies a door, the year a slum, the wind a house of bedlamites with trees in every room, the leaves attached like leather straps and light a yellow spoon, the moons beside the no, again. The year breaks down the door, the leaves are shut inside the trees in apple cores, the wind bangs in the barest rooms of Bedlam. No, again. The leaves are rooms, the no. The moon's a no. The year a vein of narrow gold, the trees gold flakes, the leaves gold leaves, the wind a whiny no, again. The rakes are brooms, the moon is skinned, and no, again. The bedlamites have wedged the no, again. The wind is bare and yellow spoons are banging on the brain. The year's wedged shut with apple cores, the no a leather stain. The slimy moon an open sore, and every room the same. I thought I'd read a kind of slightly different. Have I got time for this? Have I read how are we doing? Shall I read this and then maybe I won't read this and maybe I'll read something shorter and then we'll be done. And it's been so nice to read for you on a, what day is it? Wednesday? Is it Wednesday? On a Wednesday? So lovely. I'll read a poem called Galanthus. And then I'll maybe finish with another shortish poem. But thanks ever so much for listening so intently, and it's so nice to see you, and so nice to do a reading. Galanthus is the name of a flower. Do you know this? Do you know Galanthus? You might know as I read the poem. I'm not going to tell you what the flower is. Or am I? Maybe I am. So this book, Material Properties, is kind of informed by riddles in Old English. So there's this book of the Exeter book, which contains an anthology of poems in Old English. It contains much of the literature that we know in Old English, including the riddles, these extraordinary kind of poems that say, hey, let me describe myself and you tell me what I am. What's kind of extraordinary about lots of these riddles is there isn't a solution in the book. There are no solutions, right? So there are lots of these riddles that we don't know what the solutions are. We still don't know. That we know what some of them are by various ways. I won't kind of go into it now. But I found this really kind of rich and interesting, that there might be these texts that they describe something, but we don't know really what they describe. They have kind of features. There are things kind of happening, but we have to kind of guess what these things are. And there's lots of different interpretations, because Old English is a language that you have to translate, and every kind of translation is an interpretation. So you kind of have to know, you have to kind of have some idea of what the poem is describing in order to translate it. And translations really vary, And this is a kind of version of an Old English riddle, but it kind of isn't. But the Old English riddle itself has we don't know what the answer is, but there are lots of proposed solutions, and those solutions run from like a bucket to a revenant, like a ghost, you know? So you can hear that, you know, the idea that this single piece of writing might describe a bucket, but it also might describe a ghost, you know. The interpretations are kind of wild. But I wrote this kind of little poem kind of in response to this riddle. I can't remember which riddle it is. It's riddle 4 in a certain edition of the Old English poems. Galanthus, please don't come near. Don't offer me your hand. I saw too much of the dark, went blind, then heard the light and groped my way back here. But I'm early, right? I shouldn't hurt to stand. I shouldn't burn to think. The flame of self is white. My head the world of all I want. My love pure appetite. A snowdrop, right? And I'll finish with Little Things, the poem that Jean mentioned. And thanks very much for listening. It's been lovely to come and lovely to hear Andrew read. Lovely to be here with my friend Jean, and lovely to be here with my as unmet friends in the audience. Little Things. He says, little things, the days are long, the borage flowers blue, and our backyard vibrating now with bees and hoverflies. We know there should be more. Memory's sunlight swarms with little things, and remembered moonlit darkness too, when even from inside we'd hear their wings beating like eyelashes. So many eyes beating at both sides of the glass, the air alive, and us back then. Our memories, what use are they? The getting in our hair, our mouths, the flutter tickle on our skins. The world is what you touch, what touches you. They visited, alighting on our bodies, and we thought hardly anything was there. Thanks very much. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jacob. I was just really struck when I was rereading Jake's work, with darkness in mind in particular, by some absolutely extraordinary insights. And this one I just wanted to share with you because it's from a poem that he didn't read this evening. It's just this line, fetched from the dark like light itself. Light depends on dark. That's a really kind of, a really profound thought, and a kind of overturning perhaps of some of our expectations of what light and darkness are. So just as light depends on dark and comes from it, so speech comes from silence, and the poem or the piece of writing comes from the white space of the page. So these things are not opposites, they're not binaries. And that really struck me with great force as I reread the work. I think, given that we've overrun so shamefully and shockingly, which is all down to me, and I can only apologise, we should probably not have a Q&A, but if you would like to speak to Jake or to Andrew, we will be milling about for a little while, so please mill about with us and come over and ask your question then, or have a word. There are books for sale, I think. Both Andrew's and Jacob's books are for sale. I'm sure they would be happy to sign a copy for you. Thank you so much for coming. It's been a great way to start this little darkness season, and I hope to see you again for the other 2 events. And just another round of applause, please, for Andrew Hurley and Jacob Polley.